Hello and welcome to Medieval Monday. I ended up not recutting what I had already recorded last week. There was too much stuff that I left out or um, didn't feel quite right, and I just figured it'd be easier to record fresh. And this is the first day that there's been both no construction noise and no noise from other tenants that would provide a distraction in the background. Knock wood, that'll stay for the rest of this video, but I figured I'd give it a shot. So last episode, we talked about why the series had gone on hiatus, kind of the game plan of where things were going forward, and I concluded with a recording of a paper I gave at the Sewanee Medieval Colloquium. What I'd like to do for today is talk a little bit about the hiatus in terms of sort of the tactical and strategic nature of trying to put your best face forward in what is really it's called a precarious or contingent position, a position that is limited term or is reliant on being renewed repeatedly. Most people think that the professorate is primarily people who are going for or already have tenure. And so obviously they can do whatever they want, and, liberal, elite, ivory tower, da da da. The fact of the matter is the majority of people who are teaching college students are teaching them on limited term contracts. They're either semester to semester contracts, sometimes they're full year contracts, sometimes they're lucky, they're 3 or 5 year contracts. And then there's also this sort of burgeoning alt-ac, or alternate academic path, which is really sort of the people who are the grease that are keeping the wheels going. The people who are teaching in, not so much teaching, but in working in libraries, people who are project managers and things like that, and they quite often have advanced degrees themselves. But this path provides a little more security than being an actual professor. So, in light of that, what happens is everybody has this idea that professors work hard, they create their magnum opus. It's the result of multiple years. They release it as a book to worldwide acclaim, and then they kind of rest on their laurels for the rest of their career. And that's not true. The fact of the matter is that at least the type of position I'm in requires me to work on a lot of long-term projects that are multiple years down the road. Or to do my own work, it requires me to produce shorter pieces so that I have a track record. The problem with the long-term projects that are still ongoing when you're in a contingent or limited term position, the postdoctoral positions that I'm intend to run 2 years, is that quite often when you're done, the project isn't. And so you've spent a year or two working on a project that may be in the middle of doing something really big, but you aren't there to sort of take professional advantage of that when it occurs. And I think that's adversely affected me. I mean, quite a lot of my luck on the job market is luck. Some of it is putting my proverbial foot in my mouth, trying to make distinctions that the people on the hiring committee weren't understanding or weren't willing to get behind, and then getting trapped down a rabbit hole of trying to explain myself. That's totally on me. But anyway, so the postdoctoral position doesn't require a monograph, doesn't require a book. And I had been looking at this really as a log to chart revisions to my dissertation to become the monograph. In reality, that has become sort of one of many projects. It's one that takes sort of a back seat. Postdoctoral positions are also designed to develop skills. Now, the reality is that quite often they both develop skills and take advantage of skills that the person hired in the position already has. Sometimes it weighs more towards the latter than the former. I've been pretty lucky in that that hasn't necessarily always been the case for me. But it's a situation where you're ideally what's supposed to do is put a polish on you before you go on to your tenure track job. And it's not necessarily working out that way anymore. And we could get into a long discussion of the neoliberal university and all that stuff, but that's not really germane to this show. So I'm going to set that aside. Anyway, so I have 4 projects that I'm currently working on that are my projects. They're interrelated, and hopefully they'll have 4 distinct outcomes that rely on each other, some of which are set up for that long-term sort of thing. So if I do get lucky enough to get a tenure track position, I can sort of hit the ground running. And some of them are designed more for short-term outcomes. So the first is I'm still working on revisions to the monograph. I've revised it quite a bit. I'm finishing things up. I'm putting the introduction together. My goal is to have a polished chapter and a polished introduction to send off to presses so that I can talk to them at Kalamazoo and have something to show them prior to the conference. We'll see if that happens. There's some other things I've been working on too. The Folger class that I'm part of is doing the Folger Shakespeare Library has sort of its own version of Wikipedia called Folgerpedia. And we are building out the section of that on medieval drama, which is incredibly necessary because if you're somebody who is a community college teacher or a high school teacher and you want to teach medieval drama, both Wikipedia and sort of the default anthologies do a really poor job of explaining things. And the scholarship they're basing everything on is about 20 to 30 years old, and it's outdated. So part of what we're trying to do is fix that. And the section that I'm working on is on the staging of plays. So after this video, once it's all cut and everything and it goes up, I'm going to be working on building out the draft of my section. And then this week and Thursday and Friday, we'll be putting together the sort of basic outline of what we want to do with the idea that we're going to continue it on past this course, because this course ends with the class on Friday. So with that in mind, I will be back here on Saturday, and I will try to record Sunday for next Monday, which will get us back on schedule. But that may not happen. And then, so assuming I get that all out of the way, I'm going to be finishing revising those 2 sections. And then the Swanee paper that I showed last time is sort of a snippet of the chapter that's going to be in Benedictine Mary Magdalene. The way the book's going to be structured is it goes through the 12th through the 16th century. It's weighted much more on the 15th and 16th centuries. I think there's much more interesting stuff going on with Mary Magdalene then and the way that she shifts in signification. But I want to do a sort of build up so that people have an idea of where things are at before we get into sort of the hot and heavy. Here's how she kind of grew in significance over the 15th century, and here's what happened in the 16th century that sort of collapsed all that. The other thing I'm doing is I'm working on article length pieces. So a follow-up to the piece that I did on the staging of the Debbie Mary Magdalene. So instead of the staging, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of doubling and what is and is not likely as far as that play goes in terms of doubling. Because quite often people who are studying medieval drama are doing so based on conventions of the early modern, based on conventions of the people who are just before or contemporaries of Shakespeare. And as I mentioned in one of the videos, Shakespearean drama really comes out of a sort of, and I shouldn't make it as cut and dried as this, because it's not. But it comes out of a sense that the medieval hall play, and a hall play can be done with a much smaller audience. No, lay down. Sorry, my cat. So it can be done with a much smaller audience, or not audience, a much smaller group of players. And this is where you get the 4 men and a boy of most discussions of medieval and early modern drama. And the 4 men and a boy thing, that's not 100% accurate either. There's a number of early modern plays that if you sit down and actually look at who is on stage when, it requires more than 4 or 5 people to perform. It's a convention that was created by printers in order to sell plays. That's the long and short of it. So part of the problem is because of all this notion that we're coming from early modern plays, and early modern plays are being put on by groups of players to make money. The presumption is that that medieval plays needed to be performed as inefficiently and with as small a group of players as possible. And that's not necessarily the case. These aren't necessarily always being performed to be as efficient and cheap as possible. Sometimes they're being performed as a type of civic performance, as a performing of the wealth of the community. And in that light, it makes sense to be a little ostentatious. You don't want to go so overboard that you bankrupt everybody, obviously, but you don't necessarily want to seem like a skinflint either. So what I'm going to do for that article is I'm putting together a series of charts. I showed them last week in the Swanee colloquium piece of the staging of various pieces of medieval drama, what stages had to be there, what performers are mentioned, where the performers are at, and when. The idea behind that is I want to show that that it's impossible for certain locations and certain characters to have been doubled in these plays. And if it's impossible for this stuff to have been doubled, that means that in order to put it on, you had to have significant resources. And we have evidence of that for some of the plays. And if you had to have significant resources to put it on, then the topic of the play, even when it's heterodox, as it is in the case of Did Be Mary Magdalene, must have been enough of a part of Baudrillard's doxa, the sense of accepted belief that there wasn't a problem. So that's what that article is going to do. The other article I'm working on is a follow-up to the Long Melford piece I did, which concentrated really on the Lydgate verses at the Clopton Chantry Chapel. There's other stuff there. There's some what's called Ars Moriendi or Tempus Mundi verses. So they're Latin verses about the kind of the art of dying well, or kind of contempt of the world. You know, that the world doesn't matter, that the afterlife is more important. Those verses are there. There's a section from the Sarum Missal. Sarum is the religious use or set of practice that was popular in Canterbury. So it's sort of what the High Church Anglican might be considered to come out of. I mean, it's much more complex than that, and there's a lot of more moving parts, but in that spirit. So there's sections from the Sarum Missal that are there as well. And there's the Lady Chapel, which I talk about a little bit in the paper, but I don't really go in depth about because there's no, while I think Lydgate verses were there, there's no evidence because it's been scrubbed clean. What I want to do in this second piece is talk about the entire chapel as a, not just as a set of verses, but as sort of a multimodal or multimedia structure, the way all these things might have related to each other. And doing that, keeping in mind that a lot of what was there has been either painted over, scrubbed away, or otherwise removed, so that really all we have is carvings. And so I need to think about how to do that. And one of the things that I need to think about doing in order to do that is there are inscriptions on the exterior of Holy Trinity Long Melford that have really legalistic phrases that seem like a testament. The reason why we call a will, for example, the last will and testament, is because in the Middle Ages, at any rate, a will was split into three parts. You had the testament, you had the will, and you had the probate. And what the testament was is disposition of goods. And the will was disposition of physical property of land. And the probate was the certificate of approval that said this is legal. So when you go to probate court now, you are going to contest the legality of a will. The last will and testament is saying, I am disposing of my property, all of my property, any land holdings I have, as well as any goods, things like that. The reason for the distinction, obviously, is because, and it doesn't quite work as cleanly as I'm about to make it out to be. But when William and Normandy came over and conquered England, ostensibly the entirety of the land belonged to him, and then he gave it out in fief to various underlings. And those underlings held the property in his name. So all property ultimately devolves back to the king, which is a little bit different than the situation in France and on the continent, where you had landholders that held the land in their own right, which is why the King of England had a much more centralized government in many cases than the King of France. Because the King of France had to deal with these large independent landholders, whereas the King of England, theoretically anyway, all land devolves back to the king. So what I'm trying to do with that is, so these exterior verses at Long Melford, they come up with the same phraseology as you see in wills. And the phrasing is, pray for the soul of the testator, the person who is asking you. In a will would be the person whose will this is. Then it's often a set of categories. So his wife, and then wives will be named, his children, and all of those said such and such is bound to pray for. And sometimes it's split out even further to have categories of all Christian souls and other groups. So maybe friends or people that he's part of, like a lay confraternity. So you would have various monastic orders would have lay people that had money that would come in, and they were a lay brethren. So they had not taken orders, but they were affiliated with that religious order, religious group. So this bound phrase, what it's doing is, it is, if I am the executor of your will, then that means that I am disposing of your goods as directed in the will. And quite often I'm getting a fee for that. I'm getting something for it. In exchange for that, I am expected to perform a certain amount of prayer for your soul to get out of purgatory. And that obligation is not going to be discharged in my lifetime. It takes many more years in a human life for a soul to get out of purgatory. Since it's not going to be discharged in my lifetime, or your lifetime, the person who is the executor of my will, so I am your executor, and then I pass away, the executor of my will has that obligation as well. As part of the set of obligations I am putting to them in my will, I am saying they also need to pray for the souls of all the people that I was executor for, because I'm not going to be there to do it anymore. So what this does is this creates a sort of network of obligations. And while we have work has been done on the wills, this here is the wills of the Archdeaconry of Sudbury at the 15th century, one of a 2-volume set. What hasn't been done is, that I've seen anyway, is sort of a charting of this network of influence. So who is bound to who is getting what, how are goods and religious obligation mixed in together. And this church, I think, is part of that, because it's really functioning as an engine for generating prayer. And so to work on this article and maybe to become a second monograph down the road after I get the first one done and hopefully get a permanent gig. You have this, I'm going to build out this database. And the database is, and I talked about it very briefly, I think in the, maybe I didn't in the Swanee paper. But the database is going to basically have a list of people, organizations, and objects. And then it's going to chart the relationships between them based on the testaments and wills in the Register Baldwin. So what the Register Baldwin is a register of wills and probates, and it's a record. And it's called Baldwin because at one point probably there was somebody named Baldwin who was one of the first names. We've lost those leaves. Those leaves aren't there anymore. But that will give me sort of a picture of this network. And from there, then I can start to try to figure out how this church fits into that network. And hopefully that will give me some insight in terms of understanding the church structure itself as well as the texts as an expression of lay piety. Those are the 4 projects. As you can see, they're kind of related to each other, because the other thing that creating such a network might do is provide insights to what it would take to put on a play like the Digby Mary Magdalene, or reasons for the increase in the saints' significations over the 15th, 16th century. And East Anglia is especially interesting in that regard because wills for common people start showing up about 100 years earlier. So start showing up during the medieval period as opposed to the early modern period. So you get an interesting examination of the way that those things changed over time as well. So that's everything I kind of have laid out. And what I will do is before I forget, the 4th thing that I'm working on is, and it's a very slow process, is a transcription of John Lydgate verses. And it's a project, it's one of those long-term projects that doesn't necessarily bear fruit immediately. I've been working quite a lot on putting together the infrastructure of the site, and I've got some transcriptions done. I've got all of the Lamentations of Our Lady Maria, the Quis David, as I've mentioned before, and a good chunk of the Testament done. And what I need to do is build out the background information. I've needed to do that for a while now, and then I'll go ahead and release it with the Lamentation stuff up publicly. And before I do that, though, I'm going to submit it to the Media Electronic Scholarly Alliance to have it peer reviewed and make sure the other scholars don't see any issues with the way I've done my transcriptions and everything. Those also feed into the chapter that I've completed for the edited volume that is currently in peer review with Western Michigan Medieval Institute Publications under their ARC Medieval Press imprint, because it's Amsterdam University Press, Western Michigan, or excuse me, Medieval Institute Publication, I shouldn't say Western Michigan. And they've joined forces, and so there's sort of a weird, which imprint do you end up in sort of thing. The other thing that I'm working on is we've gotten chapters in for another volume that I'll be editing with a friend in the New Voices in Medieval Renaissance study series, or New Technology, I should say, not New Voices. New Voices is the panel I'm going to be on in Kalamazoo, which is happening in about a month. And so what that's doing, that's in its early stages. The other volume is at the press. It's being peer reviewed. All the chapters look great except for mine. My chapter, I think, has some holes in it and needed another pass, and I didn't give it another pass because I wanted to get it out the door, because the poor people at MIP have been waiting forever for this volume. So once we get that peer review back, hopefully it'll come back positively. The authors will make whatever changes are necessary. I'm sure, like I said, in my case, it's going to be a whole slew. And then that should be coming out, assuming everything's positive, sometime in the next year, maybe. But anyway, that's everything I have going on. And then applying for positions, so things are still proceeding at pace as far as that goes. We just finished the Introduction to Digital Humanities class here at McMaster, which I was co-teaching with the director of the Sherman Center. That's just finished up, so we're just waiting on their final papers to come in, and that should happen sometime next week. And then things are just moving along. And so next week I will talk probably about the Folgerpedia stuff and the Folger class, because that's going to be the bulk of my week. I may talk a little bit about the database if I get to work on that. We'll have to see. But I wanted to make sure that I got this out to you guys so I didn't pop back up and drop off the face of the earth again. And I'll talk to you again next week. Have a good day. Bye.